On a cold December morning in Broomfield, Colorado, police received what sounded like a routine welfare check. Daniel was worried. His wife wasn't answering her phone. She had just returned home after dropping off their children at school. Nothing about the call suggested what officers would soon walk into. Inside the Krug family garage, they found Lisa Krug unresponsive on the floor. She wasn't declared dead immediately. Paramedics rushed in. They began CPR. They worked fast. And then, in the middle of those life-saving efforts, something changed. A responder noticed a wound. A cut. A stab wound. Lisa Krug was not waking up. She was already gone. And the man who called the police, the man standing nearby, calm, cooperative, grieving, was the same man who had spent months terrorizing her, without her knowing it was him. This is not just a murder story. It is a story about how stalking hides in plain sight, how technology can become a weapon, and how the system meant to protect a woman instead chased a ghost, while the real threat slept beside her. Lisa Krug was not invisible. She was a mother, professional, a woman deeply devoted to her children. Friends described her as intelligent, organized, and protective. She was planning a future, one that increasingly did not include her husband. Behind closed doors, her marriage to Daniel Krug was unraveling. Lisa wanted space, independence, eventually separation. But leaving isn't always the most dangerous part. Sometimes the danger begins when a controlling partner senses they are losing control. Lisa began receiving messages. First, they were strange, unsettling, then threatening. They appeared to come from her ex-boyfriend. Emails, texts, messages that knew intimate details of her life. Details only someone close would know. The messages escalated. They referenced her children, her movements, her fears, her husband's movement. In fact, the stalker had to text a recent picture of her husband to her. Lisa became terrified. She reported the stalking. She documented everything. And she did exactly what society tells women to do when they are afraid. She went to the police. When Lisa reported the harassment, police did what seemed logical. They focused on the supposed sender, her ex-boyfriend, but they were reluctant to investigate him. Yet the messages didn't stop. Lisa's fear intensified. She installed security cameras. She altered routines. She carried protection. What no one realized was that the stalker wasn't outside her life. He was inside her home. Daniel Krug was impersonating her ex, using burner phones, fake email accounts, digital misdirection. He was manufacturing terror, then watching her react to it. And while police chased a phantom suspect, the real threat was escalating, unchecked, unseen, and growing closer to violence. By the summer of 2016, Lisa Krug was no longer just frightened. She was confused. Messages began arriving at odd hours, emails, texts, and online communications that felt deeply personal, yet slightly wrong. The sender claimed to be someone from her past, someone she once knew, someone who had re-entered her life unexpectedly. At first, the messages sounded familiar. They referenced private moments, old conversations, details that only someone close to Lisa would know. But then the tone changed. The messages became obsessive, then intrusive, then threatening. Lisa began receiving communications suggesting she was being watched, that her movements were known, that her routine was predictable, that her family was visible. One message included a photograph, a man standing outside, watching. It was not an old image. It was recent, and it was deeply unsettling. Lisa believed the sender was impersonating her former partner, an ex-boyfriend from years earlier, someone she had not seen in a long time, someone she believed might be unstable. What Lisa did not yet realize was that the messages were not coming from an outsider at all. They were coming from inside her own marriage. Investigators would later uncover a disturbing pattern. Daniel Krug had created multiple digital identities. He used burner phones, fake email accounts, anonymous messaging platforms. He carefully studied Lisa's past relationships and used that information to build a believable persona. He wrote in ways designed to destabilize her, to isolate her, to make her doubt her own perceptions. This was not impulsive behavior. It was calculated. Each message escalated slowly, designed to induce fear without revealing the source. Lisa began documenting everything. Screenshots, call logs, emails. She did what many victims are advised to do. She went to the police. Lisa told officers she believed she was being stalked. She showed them the messages, the threats, the photograph. She explained that she feared for her safety and for her children. But the response was limited. The messages did not contain an explicit threat of immediate violence. The sender's identity was unclear, and stalking laws at the time required a high threshold for action. Officers advised her to change her password, block the sender, avoid contact. The case was noted, but it did not escalate. Lisa returned home. Still afraid, still watched, still unaware that the person terrorizing her was the man sleeping beside her. The messages did not stop. They intensified. The sender demonstrated knowledge of Lisa's daily routine. When she dropped the children at school, when she returned home, when she left for errands. This was no longer a coincidence. Lisa began to fear that someone was physically following her. She reported this too. Again, no immediate action was taken. The stalker adapted. When Lisa blocked one number, another appeared. When she changed emails, a new account contacted her. When she tried to ignore the messages, the threats became more specific. The goal was no longer just fear. It was controlled. At no point did authorities seriously consider the possibility that the stalker was someone inside Lisa's household. Domestic stalking often hides behind familiarity, behind shared space, behind trust. Daniel Krug was a husband, a father, a man with no criminal record. To the outside world, he did not fit the profile of a violent offender. But behind closed doors, the pressure inside the marriage was reaching a breaking point. Lisa had confided in her mother and friends that she planned to leave. Not immediately, but eventually. She was waiting until the children were older, until the timing felt safer. Daniel knew this, and for him, the loss of control was intolerable. Investigators would later determine that Daniel's behavior shifted shortly before the murder. The messages became more frantic, more aggressive, less careful. He was losing patience. The stalking was no longer enough, and the line between psychological control and physical violence was about to disappear. By the time Lisa Krug returned to the police a second time, fear had replaced confusion. This was no longer a vague sense of unease. It was sustained psychological pressure. The messages had become relentless. The timing was precise. The sender always seemed to know where she had been and where she was going next. Lisa told officers she believed the situation was escalating. She feared the person stalking her might be getting closer, that the threats were becoming more personal, that her children could be in danger. She did everything she was told to do. She saved evidence. She reported incidents. She asked for help, but the system struggled to respond. In 2016, stalking laws, particularly digital stalking statutes, were still unevenly enforced. Unless a suspect could be clearly identified, unless there was an explicit threat of immediate violence, unless physical harm had already occurred, law enforcement options were limited. The messages Lisa received were disturbing, but carefully crafted. They implied danger without stating it outright. They were frightened without crossing the legal line required for arrest. This is the paradox of stalking cases. By the time the threat becomes obvious enough to act on, the danger is often already irreversible. Daniel Krug was never formally questioned during the stalking complaints. His digital footprint was not examined. His behavior inside the home was not assessed. The investigation focused outward, while the danger was inward. Behind closed doors, the marriage was unraveling. Lisa had begun to emotionally withdraw. She shared concerns with close contacts. She documented incidents quietly. She did not accuse Daniel openly. Not yet. And Daniel was careful. To friends, to neighbors, To authorities, he appeared calm, concerned, supportive. There were no visible outbursts, no public threats, no obvious red flags. The pressure remained invisible until it wasn't. On the morning of September 16, 2016, Lisa followed her normal routine. She dropped her children off at school. She returned home. Nothing outwardly suggested that this day would be different from any other. But the pressure inside the house had reached a breaking point. Investigators believe that confrontation occurred shortly after Lisa returned home. What happened next would end Lisa's life and expose how dangerously close the system had come to preventing it. In the aftermath, investigators would review Lisa's reports. They would see the messages, the screenshots, the warnings. They would recognize the pattern too late. September 16, 2016 began like any other weekday morning in Prince William County, Virginia. Lisa Krug woke early. She prepared her children for school. She followed a routine that had become familiar and predictable, the kind of routine that creates the illusion of safety. There was no indication, to those who saw her that morning, that something was about to go terribly wrong. Lisa drove her children to school. Witnesses later confirmed she appeared normal, focused, present. She returned home shortly afterward. That was the last time anyone would see Lisa Krug alive. Investigators later determined that the fatal encounter occurred inside the garage of the family home. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a stranger, no indication of an external intruder. The scene suggested a private confrontation, one that escalated quickly and violently. When emergency responders arrived, they initially believed Lisa had collapsed. She was unresponsive, lying inside the garage. Paramedics began CPR, assuming a medical emergency. But as they worked, something became clear. Lisa was not suffering from a cardiac event. She had been stabbed. The medical examiner would later confirm that Lisa died from a sharp force injury. This was not a gunshot, not blunt trauma, not an accident. It was a deliberate act of violence. The wound had been concealed by clothing. There was no blood visible at first glance. The scene did not resemble a violent struggle, a detail that initially masked the true nature of what had occurred. This subtlety delayed recognition. And in crimes like this, even minutes matter. After Lisa stopped responding to calls and messages, Daniel Krug contacted others and urged someone to check on her. A welfare check was requested. When first responders arrived, the focus was on emergency aid and on determining what had happened inside the home. He appeared distressed. He cooperated. He did not flee. At first, there was no immediate arrest. Domestic homicide scenes often unfold slowly. As investigators work to distinguish between tragedy and crime, investigators visited Lisa X. They contacted him. They investigated him. But there was a problem. He lived in another state. He had alibis. He denied everything, and the evidence supported him. But inconsistencies emerged. Daniel's account of events raised questions. His timeline did not fully align with physical evidence. His emotional responses did not match the unfolding reality. And as detectives began reviewing Lisa's prior police reports, the context changed. What once looked like an isolated incident now appeared connected to months of escalating fear. Investigators revisited the stalking complaints, the messages, the threats, the surveillance-like awareness of Lisa's movements. They examined digital records, email accounts, online activity, and a pattern emerged. The source of the stalking was not external. It was internal. Daniel Krug had been impersonating another man. He had fabricated threats. He had orchestrated the fear. The person Lisa had been running from was the man she lived with. Daniel Krug was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The narrative shifted instantly. This was no longer a case of a woman terrorized by an unknown stalker. It was a case of coercive control, of psychological manipulation, of a threat hiding in plain sight. The evidence suggested premeditation, not in a dramatic sense, but in a sustained pattern of behavior designed to isolate, frighten, and dominate. Lisa Krug did everything victims are told to do. She documented. She reported. She asked for help. And still, the violence happened. The moment that could not be undone. By the time the truth became clear, it was too late. Lisa Krug was gone. A mother. Professional. A woman trying to protect herself and her children. Her death was not sudden. It was the final moment of a long, invisible buildup. One that ended quietly inside a garage, far from public view. The arrest of Daniel Krug did not bring immediate closure. It opened a new chapter. One that would unfold slowly, deliberately, and under scrutiny inside a Virginia courtroom. For the first time, the fear Lisa Krug had been living with was no longer abstract. It was evidence. Prosecutors did not frame the case as a sudden act of rage. Instead, they presented it as the final outcome of a sustained campaign of psychological abuse. The stalking reports Lisa had filed became central to the case. The emails, the threatening messages, the impersonation of another man, the detailed knowledge of her movements. What once appeared as a mystery stalker was now reframed as a calculated deception. Digital forensic analysts traced the messages, IP addresses, devices, accounts. Again and again, the trail led back to Daniel Krug, the same man who stood beside Lisa at home, the same man who listened as she described her fear, the same man who claimed he was helping her stay safe. Expert testimony explained the concept of coercive control to the jury. This was not a single violent incident. It was an accumulation of behavior, isolation, surveillance, manipulation, fear. The court heard how Daniel allegedly monitored Lisa's communications, how he created an external threat to make her dependent, how the stalking intensified as their marriage deteriorated. Lisa's reports to police were read aloud. In them, her fear was clear, consistent, escalating. Prosecutors returned the jury to the morning of September 16, 2016. They laid out the timeline minute by minute. Lisa dropping off her children, returning home, entering the garage. There was no evidence of an intruder, no forced entry, no unknown DNA. The garage became the focal point. Confined space, private, unwitnessed. The prosecution argued that this was where months of pressure finally collapsed into violence. Daniel Krug's defense did not dispute that Lisa died from a stab wound. Instead, they focused on intent. They argued the act was not premeditated, that it occurred during a confrontation, that there was no plan to kill. But the prosecution countered with context. Intent, they argued, does not begin in the final moment. It is built, shaped, reinforced over time, and the stalking, documented, repeated, undeniable, provided that context. Lisa's family sat through every proceeding. They listened as her words were read aloud by strangers, as her fear was dissected, as her death was analyzed in clinical detail. At times, the courtroom fell silent, not from shock, but from recognition, because this was not a sensational crime. It was frighteningly familiar. After deliberation, the jury reached its decision. Daniel Krug was found guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict acknowledged what the evidence showed. This was not an accident, not a misunderstanding. It was the outcome of sustained abuse that ended in lethal violence. Daniel Krug was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The sentence reflected both the crime itself and the pattern that preceded it. For the court, this was not only about punishment, but about acknowledgement. No sentence could return Lisa Krug. No ruling could undo what her children lost, or erase the months she spent living in fear. The trial ended. The courtroom emptied. The case closed on paper. But the consequences continued. Lisa Krug did what society tells victims to do. She spoke up. She documented threats. She went to the police. She asked for help. And still, the danger remained. Daniel Krug's actions did not appear out of nowhere. They unfolded gradually, through messages, impersonation, fear, and control. Each incident alone may have seemed manageable. Together, they formed a clear warning. But those warnings were treated as isolated problems rather than a pattern. By the time the truth was undeniable, it was already too late. Lisa Krug's murder forced difficult conversations in Prince William County and beyond. About how stalking cases are evaluated. About how systems respond when the threat comes from inside the home. Her case became a reference point, not because it was rare, but because it was preventable. The trial brought accountability to one man, but it also exposed a larger truth. Violence is often preceded by signals that are visible, but not acted upon. Lisa Krug's story shows what can happen when escalation is missed. Lisa was more than a case file. She was a mother, professional, a woman trying to protect herself and her children. Her life mattered not only because of how it ended, but because of the courage she showed in the face of fear. Her voice exists in reports, emails, and testimony. This is not just a story about one crime. It is a reminder that danger does not always arrive loudly, that violence often grows quietly, and that listening, truly listening, can save lives. Thank you for watching Silent Evidence: True Crime Exposed. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us next time for another chilling true story.